and use it to broaden contact and discussions about especially culture in our country. So I'm very happy that we have this moment and that you've made time to for us to engage.
Thank you very much, Dr. Serote. It is indeed my honor. One had to answer the call in the affirmative so that we honor the moment of your inauguration. I mean, which has been around now, but we have not properly done this in various ways because, as you've just said, only now building the institution, which is remarkable that it is being done. Thank you very much. For the benefit of some of all the people that are listening, that are tuned in this afternoon, or depending on the timeline, wherever people are, welcome to everyone. And this is our first attempt at this game, so bear with us where we falter. But we do believe that with the energy of our guest, Professor Mongane Wally Serote. Let me just give you a brief background on who Wally Serote is. This is brief indeed. Born in Alex, Dr. Serote is known for different and varied works of poetry. I'm saying different and varied because it's been a long journey as far back as the 60s in different formats, both in South Africa and abroad during the tough days of exile. Some of the works that may be remembered include Yakali Nkomo, 1972, Tsiklo, 1974, No Baby Must Weep, which was published in 1975. The list is endless. It would be amiss of me as well not to mention that Dr. Serote has also been at the forefront of our liberation struggle. In fact, before he left for exile in 1969, he had been in detention for his political beliefs, particularly the fight for the freedoms of our people, which need not, be forgotten by some of us who understand the role of the artist, the poet, the writer, the thinker, Dr. Wally Serote. But today, the focus that has been given to us has to do in the main with discussions regarding or surrounding the poem, the long poem. History is the home address. Serote is very much well known for epic poetry, and some of these I've already alluded to. Let's just get to it. But before I do so, let me just find out, Dr. Serote, what makes the poet that you are remarkable for some of us has a lot to do as well, apart from the craftsmanship that we all admire, with the kind of checkered background, so to speak, that involves strife, that involves a lot of heartache that you must have gone through growing up in Alex and so on. Just put us in brief, in that picture. Give us the picture of how it was growing up in Alexandria.
Well, one has two thoughts and two memories about Alexandra. The one that I would like to hold on to is the fact that the elders did everything possible to try and create communities in Alexandra. Communities which brought with them the idea of Mutuki Mutukabatu. I mention that especially because when we were children, when we were young boys and eventually young men, this is really what embraced us. This is really what brought us up to the point where eventually, in reflection, in retrospect, where looks, for instance, for me in terms of politics, I remember what was called number 3 square in Alexandra.
Right.
Number 3 square was very special for people who lived in Alexandra in the sense that every Sunday, one of South Africa's outstanding political figures, Albert Lutuli, used to come there. And I have a vivid picture of him wearing khakis with a hat and the colors of the ANC. And I will not remember what was talked about, but I know the impact that he had in terms of my home, my father, my mother, my grandmother. Every time after that, when they come back from number 3 square, discussions were very lively, and there were discussions pregnant with hope. It is in retrospect that one goes to that and understands what was the significance of that. One other matter that I remember very, very, very sharply in my head, because it was so dramatic. It was when the African National Congress started the potato boycott, and the people, before they went to number 3 square, the ANC members, or even after the number 3 square, they would visit homes to come and see that people were not cooking potatoes. And the potato boycott was based on an extremely painful history of our country, where people who were arrested for passes, things like your pass was not signed by an employer, or you were forbidden to live in Alexandra because you were born outside of Alexandra, or you were forbidden to live in Johannesburg. You were arrested and would end up in Bethal or in Emelo. And the likelihood also would be that you would not come back because you'd get killed in those potato fields. Being a young boy, you don't understand the significance of that. It is only after, when you reflect, that you understand exactly what the elders were doing. And of course, a very important seed was planted. In explaining it then, in those days, is that instinctively you knew from what the elders were saying, from how the events at the number 3 square unfolded, what was said, and how people in large numbers gathered there, and people like Moses Kotane would also be there to address. All of those things, as you grow old, become your reference point to say, indeed, there was something very, very wrong in our country. But the first is to understand that when you reflect on it, to realize that the oppressed did everything possible to organize themselves, unite, so as to be able to fight against this scourge of apartheid. It's only when...
For that introduction, if you don't mind,
yes.
let me just remind anybody who's tuned in that we're talking to the South African poet laureate, Professor Mongane Wally Serote. This is organized by the Poetry Hub in South Africa in order to have discussions on matters relating to arts and culture, poetry, and so on, taken up by all of us. Thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Serote.
Yes.
Alexander was also an epicenter of artistic and cultural activities in many ways. I can think of, musicians like David Biliso, Kipi Mieketsi, and so on. Just give us a picture of how those influences were also critical in your shaping the poet, the writer that you have become.
Yes, you see, Alexander being one of the oldest locations, oldest townships, it was home to many, many people who came from all different directions of our country. And of course, because of that, it also attracted creative people, as you say, like Demi Puliso and many, many others, Jonas Gwangwa, Huma Sekela, even those who did not originate from Alexander, but the Miriam Makeba, Kefa Sumenya, people like that, all of them had a base in Alexandra. And therefore, it was a base which made them extremely creative against the greatest odds. Because what we must never forget about that time is the past system, which was the most oppressive symbol against Black people because it bound them as if they were already prisoners. And therefore, even the creative people were not an exception to this. And as they come and go, they were under this serious oppression. But the most important thing is, with that going on, there was another thing which went on. They gave life for the people who were under that intense oppression. We always looked forward to Friday, Saturday, Sunday, because the whole of Alexandra would buzz with music. There would be photographers who come there. There would be filmmakers who come there. There would be people who create all kinds of art forms to Alexandra. And that in itself was an inspiration. And one other very important thing about that is many of those people, which we must also never forget, became part and parcel of the struggle, especially being members of the ANC, and even if they were informal in the ANC, but they associated themselves. And that is because they associated themselves with the hope that the ANC was spreading about what the life of the Black people must be and how it can become a livable life rather than a life giving in to oppression, you know? Yes. So there was this vibrancy in Alexandra, which forever inspired hope, inspired a fighting spirit, inspired ambitions in people, inspired for people to find ways to come out of this oppression. Yes.
One of your most iconic poems, I mean, I'm talking about the shorter poems because, of course, we also celebrate your epic poems. But one of them is City, and I first read that at high school, and I was blown away by the imagery that you present about how the city represents this big, monstrous system of oppression for Black people. And as you've just said, where the passbook was spectrum, this machinery of oppression and demonization of Black people. Just share a few insights about that poem and how it came about, if at all you remember.
You know, the thing about Joburg City is the fact that it depended, it anchored, it was built on the shoulders, the legs, the hands of the people that it oppressed. It was built on the strength that it despised. It was built on a life which it completely abused, through oppression, through exploitation, and through, again, with the past system, because you went to work, but throughout you were under absolute terrorism of the bus system, where you are stopped as if you don't belong anywhere where you are, yet at the same time, the city wanted you to be where you are. A very antagonistic contradiction of a people. So you saw these two lives of the elders of our township who suffered under the yoke of this oppressive city, which demanded them to go into holes to dig the gold, which demanded on them to fix the land, to build buildings, to build railways, to build highways, to build roads, to create wealth that they would never in any life imagine it to belong to them. They created for other people. And this is what the contradiction that I was consistently trying to understand about Johannesburg and Alexandra as an Eastern. You know, Alexandra and Johannesburg are 9 kilometers apart. And yet they are so vastly different. One living under a heavy yoke of oppression, and the other beaming and blooming, glittering, because it is a city of gold, you know? It is a city where the wealth sought by the world exists. Such a different antagonistic contrast that it was not possible to ignore and not understand what it stood for. You see, and you sought permission through the pass system to enter it and to exit it. And at any point, this pass system could trap you and you'd end up in jail. You would see then how you are trapped at bus stops when the Kwela Kwela, stops there, and you see a lot of people at the back of this truck arrested for passes, arrested for trespass, arrested for permits, all of which talk to the pass system, which was a whip controlling the black people. So as a young man growing up in Alexandra, this was very stuck in my head, It demonstrated that there was something drastically wrong and cruel and very inhuman in between these two places where people lived and worked and were countrymen and women, but defined differently, you see. So that is what gave birth to Joburg City, the poem.
It's memorable, that poem. Let's come back to the fact that despite all those possibilities of incarceration for yourself and so many of your colleagues and friends at the time, you were an activist at an early age, and you were organized as artists in different organizations. Was it one of them, if I'm not mistaken, the Mdali, if I'm not mistaken again? You were involved, but you were an activist from an early age, a long time before you left the country. What were some of the triggers that despite all those possibilities of danger to yourself and to your family, you still felt compelled to partake in the struggle, with full force as you did?
Yes, I have described almost as much as possible, almost in detail, the oppression,
the conditions, yes,
the oppressive conditions that we grew up under, and of course, whether conscious or unconscious or sometimes deliberate, the whisperings of the elders about what it means to who they were at that time. The discussions that they held, I remember one thing that actually was etched in my mind in 1960 or 61, the Sharpeville event, how, you see, every morning before I went to school and every afternoon when I came back, I had to read the newspaper for my father. My father had never been to any classroom. So he always asked me. So out on that day, I read to him the events of Sharpeville, even as he tried to hide the pain in him, I sensed it as I read and explained as to step by step what happened. And of course, his responses, even if it was silence as I was talking, or even if he exclamation that he made, it was a signal. It was a signal that there is something very dangerous going on around us. As a growing young boy, that's how it manifested itself. But later then, it it became very clear what the problem was, and eventually it became very clear as to how that problem must be resolved. I mustn't exaggerate and say clear. It was an intuitive thing that you cannot live under this terrible yoke and pretend that it is normal. So something had to be done. So all of that begins with, first of all, discussions among us as young boys, discussions with the elders or listening to them, or reading the newspaper as I did, and your consciousness begins to grow until the time when you say, it is very obvious, as the ANC said, either you submit or you fight. But even as you reach that point, how to fight is still a major road which you must define for yourself. You know? And that is how everything began, you see. On the one hand, you value the community that you come from, because, as I say, Alexandra was built on Mutuki Mutukabat. All the elders were my fathers or mothers. All the elders were either my elder brothers or my elder sisters. All the elders were my relation, and they could correct me about this or that, or talk to me about this or that. Even as at a certain time you saw the crime, you saw the senselessness of killing each other and so on. All of that would be interpreted by the people around you. But at the end of the day, it was very clear that something is very wrong and something had to be done.
Thank you. The conversation, for those who have just joined us, is with Prof. Mongane Wally Serote, the South African poet laureate, a child of Alexandra, a child of South Africa, a very proud African thinker, scholar, poet. Thank you very much for that brief account. And how does the poet Mongane Wally Serote emerge within this quagmire of so much happening around you? How do you then, out of so many possibilities that a young person, at that time might have considered, poetry became one of them, and became, writing in general became your vocation for a lifetime almost.
Yes, there is a man that I must absolutely thank, even as I cannot explain how that happened. There was a teacher when I was in maybe standard 5, standard 6 or so, or even maybe lower classes. Whenever we did English literature, I was fascinated by how he analyzed and pulled us into the literature, whether it was Shakespeare or the different novels, how he struck one's imagination, how he removed the words from the book and put them into your imagination to even see the snow, see the daffodils, see Paris, see London, see New York from just reading the books. And I think initially the manner in which it started for me is I began to imitate the writers that he was talking about. But at the point at which I tried to locate what I was going to write about into my situation, there was this I don't know, I must describe the young girl, a child at that time, see, who I wrote a poem to. And I realized, I think it was an eye-opener, a sore eye-opener, because after I wrote it and gave it to her, she gave it to the teacher, and the teacher was totally not impressed with me. Absolutely not impressed with what I'd written. I can't remember what I wrote. And I had thought giving it to this girl who I loved very much, even at that young age. I thought she would be very happy and hold this thing so that it is between me and her. But I was terribly punished about that. And it was a secret that I held and never divulged at home, never talked about it. But I decided at that time that from then on, whenever I write anything, I'll keep it to myself and not tell anybody. And for a while, this is what I did until one day when I had to announce to my father and say to him, look, I really want to write poetry. And of course, he didn't understand what that nonsense was. That's what he called how do you ever imagine that you can write a book? How do you ever imagine what is poetry? But the story that I love to talk about that is then how I was salvaged by my grandmother, who for whatever reason, even as she had never been to school herself, but understood that this is something that she should encourage me to do. So I'm saying, here was something. I can't explain how it got into me to say I have to do this. Because even as the odds were against me doing it, I mean, I was severely punished by the teacher, but I continued to write. I entered into a serious conflict with my father about writing poetry, but I continued to do it. Fortunately, fortunately, my grandmother understood and protected me. So there are lots of things that I cannot explain about that, but I'm happy that I persevered through it and I was committed to it. I must also tell you a story. When I was detained in 1969, the first thing when I went into the torture room at Compol building, and I met that major, Sonapul, he recited one of my poems as a demonstration that I was I was going to be done in their hands. There was a poem that I'd written about how a cat stalked a bird and how it jumped and killed the bird. And he recited this poem as he approached me. And before he ended the poem, I did not know what had happened because I was lights out. He had almost beaten me to pulp, you know. But it made me understood then that there is this something in this poetry thing which I must pursue and understand. And I remember when I was doing matric that I decided I want to write poetry as a revolutionary, and that this poetry must be a weapon to fight with. I did not know what I meant then, but that's what I said. I remember sitting with my friends when we were deciding, you are doing matric, what are you going to do? And I said to them, I want to be a revolutionary writer. I want to use this poetry to fight. And that's where this whole poem thing comes from.
And the decisions that you had to make at that time must have been also hard because you were sympathetic. I mean, you were part of the struggle. Sympathetic is not the right word. You were part of the struggle. But at the same time, as most artists would say, you also wanted to have your own voice distinct from the voice of somebody who pens a pamphlet, a slogan, and so on. What are some of the models and the challenges that you were contending with at that time?
You know, the fortunate thing, Sandile, is that I developed a culture of reading at a very young age, you know. And let me share with you how we got the books to read. We stole books at bookshops.
Wow.
We created little groups of people and taking turns to go and steal books from. Then there was a bookshop called Vanguard, which we completely raided and built libraries in Alexandra, underground libraries.
Wow.
And that culture of reading, also knowing that some of the books were banned, it was something very persuasive to do, you know. The only problem at that time was something in one's head did not interpret that it were possible to write about us. But something in what we read was so appealing because also it was human to keep searching. The writing about us happened in two ways. One day we stole Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and it was banned there.
Wow. Wow.
And it was Chinua Achebe who then demonstrated very clearly in my mind that you can write about Black people. But also people like Net Nakasa, Ken Temba, Stanley Muchwari, when the classic book came out, the classic magazine came out, and many of the articles which would go into the classic would come out in Rand Daily Mail, and we read them. Then that was a demonstration which also confirmed what we suspected, that there was something very wrong in our communities, that we can actually write about this. We can write about the feelings we have, about the dreams we have, about exploring what is it that we do under this conundrum, you know?
Mongane Wally Serote, the South African National Poet Laureate, we're having a conversation on poetry, history, collective memory, and the dreams of this country, the continent, and the world, particularly in times of Black Lives Matter, gender-based violence, and so on. Dr. Serote, South Africa is not the kind of country at the moment that we would all like to be, especially when it comes to issues of gender-based violence. How does such issues affect you as one of the elders in our liberation struggle, but also as a poet, a South African, a father, a brother, an uncle, and so on? How should somebody, respond to these disturbing challenges of our times?
You are referring to something extremely painful, something extremely serious, something that then it's a national matter that we must find a manner to address very systematically. That's a reference point that I would like to use. In order for us to address this matter, we should also be guided by what Fanon said about the oppressed people. So that you see, it is not an individualistic matter or an issue about men and women only. We must understand that, we're for 300 years under severe oppression. Severe because it has been extremely violent to both men and women in our country, Black people. And therefore, that is where our challenge is. How do we address this institutionalized violence in our nation? That oppression, that exploitation, added to the fact that it was a discrimination, a systematized discrimination against Black people, could only be maintained through severe violence of people. And therefore, that violence meted on people nurtured violence among people. And under such circumstances, it will always be the ones who are weak who become the utter victims of that violence, which is rampant in the nation. So I want us to say when we start addressing it, we as men must be able to say, to find a manner to say to ourselves, since we know that there has been this institutional violence, what is it that we do to commit to dismantle it? We should not do it alone. We should do it together with the women. How do we dismantle it? The first and most important institution, in my view, among us is our families. How do we start the discourse, the discussion? How do we nurture an understanding of this institutionalized violence, which emanates from even institutionalized racism? What, how do we identify it? How do we identify its roots? How do we pull out these roots together, men and women? We must not build a society which talks about either men or women. We must talk about a situation where together, women and men together, discuss how to root out this stubbornly anchored violence in our society. How do we define it? How do we understand it? How do we seek its opposite, where we say, for life to be have any value, men and women must hold hands together. At the present moment, that is missing. But I am proud to say, in 1979, in Angola, President Oliver Tambo introduced a conference of women to be held in Angola in 1979. And it was the first time when I heard the concept of non-sexism, which we struggled with and tried to understand what it means and how, if it comes to us, how do we do it? And you must now understand that from then on, it is a matter that is integral in our minds. There is non-sexism, and therefore it becomes very important that it becomes a culture. This is the thing now. What is it that we should do to understand this non-sexism, to find the methods to implement it in institutions of our country, starting at the home? What is it that we should be doing so that we don't talk about the men or the women, but we talk about the nation, about the men and the women who must understand this non-sexism and who must focus on it, unravel it, and make it a culture that is livable. This is the challenge, you see, that we have.
It is indeed a big challenge and a serious indictment on our society. We're talking to the South African National Poet Laureate, Professor Mongane Wally Serote. If you've just joined us, welcome. We're just about 40 minutes or so before we finish. So let me come back to you, Dr. on a follow-up to this question. There's a great sense in certain quarters in South Africa that perhaps the state, as a machinery elected by the people to serve and protect them, especially women and children, is not doing enough. What is your sense about that sense of anxiety, desperation, on the nation?
You see, at the point at which we blame something else on this matter, I think it is abdication of duty. The state is not going to be able to do this thing on its own. Let us understand that very clearly. We have heard the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, talk about this over and over and over and over, and as he does so, young women are being killed. What that should say to us is there must be an organic link between what the state does and what the nation does. As South Africans, let us very quickly arrive at this point where we say the state cannot do things for us. We have to partner with the state, as I was saying, to completely intervene and transform our institutions in the country so that non-sexism is a reality, whether it is at school, at church. The state is not going to come to church and change sexism in churches. It is the church itself, it is the schools themselves, it is the hospitals themselves, it is the state itself, it is all the institutions of our country where this matter must be taken. And I think in terms of our being Africans, the first and most important thing to ask ourselves is what is it that we should do to create a family so that a family is a family for us. Remembering that as Africans, we had built a very extended family, a very broad reference point for bringing up all the cultural issues, the heritage, a discourse of Mutuki Mutukabatu. What is it that we should do now? Both the state and the nation. What is it that we should do to refer back to that experience which we came from far back, where elders, the elders of a family knew that their duty was nothing else but to give love to the young, to the little ones. Now, when we interpret that, we say, I don't want to take my little children to my elders because they spoiled them. They were not spoiling them. They were teaching them what is this love which you give free of charge, openly, with grace. What is it? What is it? How do you do it? Alleviating the weight from the parents who must do some other things. Even as the parents are not there, this thing is still a home for the little ones, for the elders, for those who have grown up. It's still a home. And we should begin in our families as we do this. This discussion must start. What is it that we should do to evaluate that family system which our people created, and how do we bring back the discussions in the home which were on the basis of storytelling and all that, to bring up the little ones. Those were the stories which our parents told to shape our thinking. I'm saying the state, they must support that effort which the communities are doing. Let us find a relationship between what the state does and what we do, and stop pointing fingers at the state. I know that the state has to serve us, but also we must say, given the background of our country, 350 years of utter oppression, we cannot just rely on what the state does. We have to do something ourselves to transform that whole oppressive, exploitative, violent culture,
Dr. Serote, today this is the Freedom Day in Mozambique, and it's a very special month for us as well in South Africa, and you've written extensively different ways in your work In one of them, for instance, you talk about the Soweto, no more strangers. If I may just read a few lines, it were us children of Soweto, Langa, Kagiso, Alexandra, Kukuletu, and Nyanga, us, people with the longing of resistance, us, who will dare the mighty, for it is freedom, only freedom, which can quench our thirst. We did learn from terror that it is us who will seize history, our freedom. I'll stop there. This is No More Strangers. You published this from Gaborone in Botswana, Dr. Serote. Any comments on these lines?
Yes. The most important thing, which we have been saying since we started this discussion, is for us to understand as a people that we have the strength and the understanding to change things. When I say no more strangers, I'm saying we are not strangers to taking initiatives. We are not strangers to freedom. We are not strangers to transform our lives and make it the best. Well, we can't be strangers to that. And the evidence of that is all over the African continent. Even as now we speak, our continent is in such dire straits. The fact of the matter is that the African continent and the diaspora, African diaspora, have set the pace of you can transform and change your life. What we must not forget, which all of us poets at all times try to remind ourselves, whenever an outstanding leader emerged on the continent, the gun was already pointing them to put them down. And there was no hesitation in putting them down. Sit down and just do an audit of how many of African leaders were killed, how many of them were couped. All of this is consciously and deliberately planned to ensure that this very wealthy continent, this very endowed continent, never functions. Everything of value of it belongs elsewhere. I am saying, understanding this, we as a people must say we can never be strangers to freedom. We can never be strangers to saying this has to be done at all costs to recreate, to rebirth, to reawaken the continent, to be African Renaissance rebels on the continent, in the diaspora. We cannot be strangers to that. To become Pan-African activists who want to unite Black people, Africans, wherever they are, to be humane in their contribution in the whole world, globally. We can never be strangers to that. It is something which those who came before us nurtured and cultivated with utter consciousness that the only alternative for this world to function properly is when people are progressive and humane. That poem wants to say that in its poetic form as a gift that we got from the many, many leaders of this African continent who did almost everything in their power. Lumumba, Mondlane, Cabral, O.R. Tambo, Machel, all of these leaders, Nyerere. Let us reclaim everything that they stood for and say, because we know and are conscious of this, we are not strangers to seeking freedom, and we will find freedom and create it ourselves in our own objective circumstances. This is what the poet is trying to say to us.
Yes.
Let us not listen to anything that is that.
Pardon me. And also there is this central theme in your work, the idea of memory as a collective experience. But also the other theme, I mean, there are so many themes, but one of the themes that is constant again, as you've been talking about elders and so on, is the idea that we're rooted somewhere. We should have a sense of home. In history, the home address, you keep on saying, you did not forget your address, even if you go away. When they ask you, you come, you must come and search for the address and give them. And when you return, you must know where to go.
Yes, history is the home address, was inspired by something that I did not know at the time what it meant. Hence my desperation to try and talk to it. There was a time here after President Mandela, as he was handing over to President Mbeki, there was a vitriolic attack, camouflaged in all kinds of ways to hide something which was key to the transformation that was happening. And at a certain time, it was even coined to say, is this person fit to govern? And this concept was perpetuated. How I wish that at that time we could have woken up and understood what all of that meant. This poem, History is the Home Address, is inspired by that moment when it became very clear to me that the manner in which a discourse was being created in the country, a discourse of creating doubt among the oppressed, a discourse of creating doubt about the whole culture of struggle and revolution, which brought about dreams of dreams within the nation, the South African nation, was being challenged in very subtle manners. I then had to find out and say, there is a history which can only become a reference point for us to try and understand these disguised daggers that are being thrown around, that are being shoveled around, wanting to destroy something so precious, our freedom. And as I was saying, that address is the dreams of the African leaders who paid prices, including supreme price, to try and liberate the country. That is the address that we have, which we must consistently refer to, reference for ourselves, and develop, and become activists backed up by that understanding. We are fortunate in the sense that as South Africans, we come from a country which created the oldest revolutionary movement, almost one of the oldest in the world. We can never ever throw away that history. No, we must never allow anyone. No one must intervene when we say that is our address. Address of the past, address of the present, address of the future. This is what inspired History is the Home Address.
Thank you, Dr. Wally Serote, our national poet laureate of South Africa. We're talking in brief here towards closure. I think I've got 4 minutes. Am I right? Yeah, we've got 4 minutes. Then we're going to call it off.
Yes.
Yeah. So this poem, in the sense, is entering into a conversation that possibly still continues. Would I be incorrect to say that? The debate
it continues.
Of the struggle in certain instances, but also certain provocations about what people consider to have gone wrong, in how even some of our leaders respect the history that we are looking to.
Yes, Sandile, what I really always want to refer to as which has become our address also, our home address.
Right.
Remember what happened in August of 2016 when in this country we were going to local government elections, and as if people were required, 3 million people were required. They did not vote. 3 million people who had been endorsing the culture of non-racialism, non-sexism, democracy, and prosperousness of the country. Year after year, voting and saying we believe that this is how our country must move and the direction it must take. When those elections happened, as if they were choir, somebody was conducting a choir, they stopped. And a huge price was paid because of that. The oldest movement of our country paid dearly because it had been distanced from the people. It was no longer serving the people. It was actually beginning to work against the people. The people understanding this, they said we cannot support this thing which is moving in this trajectory. I think intellectuals of this country, academics of this country, must use that as a reference point to say, how did we forget our home address?
How did we go wrong, as it were? Mongane Wally Serote, we're about to close. Any last word from you?
My last word is that we have a history in this country, very rich. Let us defend it, protect it, and promote it. We should not be deceived by fly-by-nights. That's my.
Thank you very much, Wally Mongane Serote.
Sandile, thank you very much for having given us your time. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Tate.
And to the organizers, Linda and Paul, thank you very much.
No, thank you for a wonderful discussion. We can end it there. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you. History is our home address.